Hello, and welcome back to Missouri's Civil War. Today we begin with the wartime experiences of one Missourian, Samuel Langhorne Clemens. In his post-war life, Clemens rose to international fame under the pen name Mark Twain. But in early 1861, he seemed every bit as conflicted and perhaps ambivalent about the war as many ordinary Missourians. Clemens later described himself as being, quote, strong for the Union, end quote. But in the spring of 1861, he had joined a pro-Confederate militia that was organized in his hometown of Hannibal. His career as a soldier lasted for about 2 weeks. When the unit decided to disband, Clemens took off on a stagecoach to the Nevada Territory. He later reflected, "We were the first men that went into the service in Missouri, and we were the first that went out of it anywhere." His military career was by no means typical. Most volunteers served a good deal longer. But Clemens's recollection of this period says much about the turbulent state of life in Missouri. There was a good deal of confusion, Twain recalled. In the summer of 1861, Missouri was, as I've said, in the national spotlight. It was only later that the state seemed to recede from the attention of federal leaders in Washington and Richmond, who became preoccupied by developments in the East. Yet in the first year of Civil War, Union and Confederate leaders each wished to secure this divided border state, which was still up for grabs and each considered vital. Today we consider the significance that Missouri held. Abraham Lincoln believed that keeping Missouri within the Union was necessary for federal victory. For Jefferson Davis, the president of the new Confederate States of America, Missouri was a valuable prize that he believed could tip the war in the South's favor. At different points during this course, I'll call your attention to some of the suggested readings that I've listed for you. These are books that have been well received or especially important in shaping historians' understanding of the war. And one such text is a recent monograph by Louis Gertheis, a professor of history at the University of Missouri St. Louis. And it's called simply The Civil War in Missouri, a Military History. I think Louis Gertheis has written the single best one-volume history of the war. He's a sharp-eyed writer, a very thorough historian, and I bring him up at this moment because I really like the way that Gertheis frames the contest for Missouri in this early part of the war. Gertheis shows that for months Missourians had favored neutrality. The collapse of the Price-Harney Agreement doomed that neutrality, and the failure was painfully evident at the Planter House meeting I've described before. On July 4, 1861, President Lincoln spoke to a special session of Congress and forthrightly rejected neutrality. Neutrality, he said, would be disunion completed. The policy, he wrote, quote, recognizes no fidelity to the Constitution, no obligation to maintain the Union. And while very many who have favored it are, doubtless, loyal citizens, it is, nevertheless, treason in effect, end quote. That neutrality was treason in effect. In Lincoln's opinion, neutrality in Missouri tied the hands of Union men. It failed to stanch the menace of Confederate support in the border states. Such opposition was a key reason why the president ultimately acceded to Frank Blair's demand that William Harney be withdrawn from command. Had the Price-Harney Agreement held, the continued growth of the Missouri State Guard was almost certain. The state militia drew recruits and funds from wealthy central counties, and the possibility that Jackson's troops might also secure the Great Rivers, this was worrisome to Blair and also to Lincoln. Even in an age where railroads had begun to transform America, binding this far-flung republic together, the Mississippi and Missouri rivers remained vital lifelines of commerce. Railroad development in the South had been uneven, lagging far behind the industrializing North, and as a result, Confederate states were relatively more dependent upon river transport. Union control of the Mississippi threatened to cleave the Confederacy in two and to deal a powerful blow to the Cotton Kingdom. In addition, control of the Missouri meant access to the far west, including the wealth of California and the Pacific coast. For Lincoln and the Union, preserving the loyalty of the border states was critically important. The North began the Civil War with some obvious advantages. With loyal border states in the fold, The Union's population of 22 million far surpassed that of the South, whose population was about 9 million. Of that, 3.5 million were enslaved. The North also boasted a far better railroad network and a more diversified industrial economy. Its troops would be the best fed, best supplied military force in history. And these advantages, of course, do not determine or ensure Union victory. Soldiers, after all, have to fight, have to win battles. The decisions of officers are critical. And you'll hopefully see that at many points during this war, things could have broken in different ways. As I've said, contingency is always present. It's hardly assured that the North would win. Early in the war, Lincoln moved carefully to preserve the loyalty of conservative Unionists in Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, even if that meant resisting calls by abolitionists to strike at slavery, the foundation of the South's society and its economy. As the president reportedly told one aide, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." Lincoln was surely pleased with the success of Nathaniel Lyon and his bold actions in the first month of war. After federal forces sent Governor Jackson and other Southern sympathizers fleeing from Jefferson City, the Union Army declared those state offices now vacant. To fill the power vacuum, members of the state convention, which had met in February and had decided against secession, that spring they came back and they declared that the governor and his supporters had forfeited their right to rule by resisting federal authority. A quorum of the springtime convention reassembled in Jefferson City, and it declared that the state executive offices were vacant, the legislature was non-existent, and in their stead, in their absence, the state convention would rule Missouri as a provisional Unionist government. This so-called Long Convention would lead the state for years until another government would be elected under a new Missouri Constitution. The leader of this provisional authority was Hamilton Gamble. The new provisional governor was a St. Louis attorney, a conservative former Whig, and previously a judge on the Missouri Supreme Court. You may recall that he cast the dissenting vote in the state Dred Scott decision, denying Dred Scott his freedom. We should pause to note that at this moment there are three main factions in Missouri politics. First, the secessionists, led by Claiborne Fox Jackson, and the state legislators who have fled the state capital. Next, there were unconditional Unionists, led by Frank Blair in St. Louis. And third, you have conditional Unionists, more conservative, exemplified by Hamilton Gamble. Like other conditional Unionists, Gamble believed that owning slaves was a constitutionally protected right. The provisional governor's political moderation would be evident on August 3rd, when he extended amnesty to all men who had taken up arms under the Jackson government, who would now voluntarily return their allegiance to the Union. Few secessionists took him up on the offer. Gamble did not immediately try to raise a state militia, fearful that that would wreck the state's finances, and he worried that rebels might enroll merely for the sake of obtaining arms that they would then use against the Union. The short-lived policy of armed neutrality in both Missouri and in Kentucky provided for the Confederacy a northern border that stretched for some 600 miles from the Appalachian Mountains in the east to the Ozark Mountains in the south and Indian Territory in the west. And one can hardly overstate the risks for the Union if either Kentucky or Missouri, or worse, both came under rebel control. For the Confederate states, the potential importance of this expanded upper South border was enormous. The manpower that these states could give to the Confederacy was considerable. And remember, in the South, they are so strapped for manpower that 80% of the adult white male population will serve in the military. And so adding these large populous states to the north, this is a very, very big potential asset for the South. After Union troops routed the Missouri State Guard at Boonville, Jackson and Price retreated southward, all the way to Cowskin Prairie in the southwestern corner of the state. Fewer than 10,000 volunteers had joined them there, but Sterling Price began to drill them into a more disciplined force. On July 12th, Governor Jackson traveled east to Richmond with David Rice Atchison, former Missouri senator and a close friend of Jefferson Davis. The Confederate president seemed skeptical of Jackson, but he assured the Missourians that the rebel Congress would pay Missouri troops when funds became available. Jackson, for his part, told Davis that he would work to withdraw Missouri from the Union once he returned to the state. Neither of these promises amounted to very much. For the first 2 years of war, pro-Confederate Missourians worked to take the state out of the Union with limited effect, and they received little aid from the Confederate government. After all, much of the state, especially north of the Missouri River, was far removed from the Confederate supply lines. The whereabouts of secessionist Secretary of State B.F. Massey were unknown. State Treasurer Alfred Morrison, he'd been captured, returned to Jefferson City as a prisoner of Union troops. And so Confederate claims to control or authority in Missouri were tenuous at best. On August 5th, Governor Jackson returned to Missouri by way of Memphis. He stopped with Atchison in New Madrid, near the Mississippi River. New Madrid, for those of you that aren't local, is one of many wonderful local pronunciations. Some of our other gems, Versailles, Nevada, Hayti, New Madrid had recently been occupied by Confederate troops under Gideon Pillow. And there the exiled governor met with Missouri State Guardsmen under M. Jeff Thompson. At this early point in the war, you can see two concentrations then of rebel forces in southwestern Missouri. In the southwest, you have Sterling Price. In the southeast, you have Jeff Thompson. And it's in the southeast that Jackson will issue a proclamation of independence that declared Missouri was a sovereign state, and citing the sweeping powers granted to him by the Militia Act of 1810, he was working to move Missouri into the Confederacy. Many Missourians, though, look upon Jackson's declaration with skepticism. The state was still deeply divided, and this polarization will provide the backdrop for awful guerrilla violence that we'll discuss within a couple of weeks. By midsummer in 1861, there existed in Missouri two rival governments, one Unionist, one pro-Confederate, each claiming to be the lawful authority and representative of Missourians. Neither seemed fully legitimate from their enemy's vantage, and their claims to power would be tested time and again. For next time, we will conclude our third week with Nathaniel Lyon's advance upon southwest Missouri and the first major battle to take place in the state. Until then.